right. And continuing on, the Paper of the Year award is always a challenging one because there are so many outstanding papers that are published in our field, and there are really many, many contributions that could have received the recognition of the Paper of the Year award. I think one of the really noteworthy advances of the last few years has been the application of exon skipping in the treatment of disease, both Duchenne muscular dystrophy and spinal muscular atrophy in particular, where really remarkable progress has been made. And so I think it's very appropriate that Richard Finkel is the recipient of the Paper of the Year award for his paper on the treatment of infantile-onset spinal muscular atrophy with Nusinersen, which demonstrates, I think, very beautifully the fantastic potential for applying this science of oligonucleotide therapeutics to a fatal disease. So, Richard?
It's indeed a great honor to receive this award on behalf of over 100 colleagues that have contributed to this project. In addition, I have a second talk this afternoon, so the two will be coordinated. What I'm going to speak about this morning will be a little bit of background on what is spinal muscular atrophy and the genetic basis, and then to focus specifically about this paper, which was more of a proof of concept and helped guide us to identify the path forward for the clinical trials and to the ultimate approval of this drug, Nusinersen, an ASO. So it's now one of 4 ASOs that's been approved by the regulatory agencies for treatment of human disease. And these are my disclosures. And I'm going to start now with just, again, a brief overview of what is spinal muscular atrophy. So these are a group of genetically based conditions that principally affect the motor neuron. And I'm going to talk about the most common of these, which is linked to 5q, or classic SMA. And this is a disease with an incidence of about 1 in 11,000 births, and it's very common carrier frequency of about 1 in 40 in all ethnic groups. And the prevalence is about 45,000 individuals living with spinal muscular atrophy in the United States, Europe, and the Pacific Rim countries. So it is a rare disease, but not all that rare. And the cause of spinal muscular atrophy is a homozygous deletion or a deletion mutation in the survival motor neuron 1 gene, the SMN1 gene. And what would otherwise be a lethal condition in humans is rescued by a backup copy, which is normally not needed in humans that have SMN1, but in the absence of SMN1 due to the mutation, you're totally dependent on this backup SMN2 gene, as I'll demonstrate. Okay? Now, the pathology of SMA is that it's primarily a motor neuron disorder. So as shown over here in the right-hand panel, you can see that there's a loss of motor neurons, and it leads to neurogenic atrophy in muscle. And also there's impaired transmission at the neuromuscular junction due to a simplification and pretzel formation. So the lack of the SMN protein, which is the gene product, causes widespread changes in the motor neuron at the level of the cell and the neuromuscular junction, and leading to neurogenic atrophy. And in the case of the children that have this condition, it leads to a developmental arrest, meaning that they may develop a certain skill such as sitting, but then never progress beyond that. And eventually, it is a progressive disorder. This is a neurodegenerative disease. So eventually, there is progressive loss of strength and motor function. And in the young babies, it affects breathing and feeding muscles with high morbidity and early mortality, as I'll show you. So there's reduced survival. So there's great unmet need for this condition. And this cartoon just briefly shows that The first 100 years after the original description by Verdnick and Hoffman in the late 19th century, the first 100 years was to define the phenotype, and then this last 20 years or so is expanded in the bottom after the discovery of the SMN1 and SMN2 genes by Melke and colleagues in 1995. And the SMA targeted SMA as a disease warranting special funding, and that led to the development of animal models and high-throughput screening. And in about 2007, that was a year, 2006, where standard of care guidelines developed for treatment of SMA, and the ASO concept really took off. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is what's happened between 2006 and the rapid process of going through preclinical, then the clinical testing, and eventually the approval of Nusinersen as the first drug treatment for SMA in late 2016. So this is just a general schema to show you that SMA has a spectrum, and about 60% of the patients have what's called type 1. And these are very severe babies who never achieve sitting, and they typically die in infancy unless they're given massive feeding and breathing support. There's a somewhat milder intermediate phenotype, type 2, where the children do achieve sitting but never walk, and they typically live into the young adult years. And then there's a milder phenotype called type 3, where the children do achieve walking but may lose this over time, and they have normal life expectancy. So we think of SMA as a spectrum, but we break it down into these groups. And you're going to see more about this little baby later in this afternoon's talk as the child progressed through the clinical trial. So keep this in mind. So let me show you what this really looks like. These are twins at 6 months of age, and this is the normal twin, Christopher. And I have permission from the parents to share these videos of their children. So here's a nice, healthy little boy. You can see how he bears weight. He's got good head control. When I tip him around, he's having a good old time. Okay? And then when I put him down, you'll see how he can lift his head up, and he's trying to even start to roll over. And compare this to Charlotte, his twin sister, who has SMA type 1, again, 6 months of age. And I think you can appreciate her very poor head control and how I have to support her to get her up to sitting. And then over here, you can see that when I try to lift her up under her arms, you'll notice in a moment how she just slips right through. There's really no control there. And when I do lift her up, you'll see that there's no weight-bearing effort on her legs. So this poor little girl, the parents struggled with different treatment decisions and elected to take a palliative care or comfort approach, and she unfortunately died 2 months later of a respiratory illness. So that's much of the natural history, unfortunately, of SMA. So to advance here. So the second part now is to focus on the genetics behind SMA. So this is the SMN1 gene, and you can see it encodes for 8 exons, 1 through 8. And here's the backup SMN2 gene. It's an inverted repeat. It includes the same 8 exons, but there are 5 nucleotide differences between the SMN1 and the SMN2 gene. And most important of these is a C840 C to T change. And this is affects the splicing and largely, but not completely, excludes exon 7 from the transcript. So this is the main problem in SMA that you'll see here, is that if you have a normal SMN1 gene, you make a full transcript. If you have the SMN2 gene, about 90% of the transcripts are lacking in exon 7, and only 10%, again, because of the splice site not being complete. There's a little bit that comes through and includes exon 7. And it's this small amount of full-length transcript that keeps these babies alive. So what happens in the normal situation is the SMN1 gene makes a native protein, and in the absence of that gene, these babies are totally dependent on the backup SMN2 gene and on this small amount of protein. And I would point out that this protein is identical to that which is generated from the SMN1 gene. It's just a protein deficiency. You're not making enough of it. So the therapeutic strategies are focused on how do we modulate the SMN2 gene to try to move this more towards inclusion of exon 7 to generate more of a full-length transcript and more of this full-length protein. And that's exactly what Nusinersen does, and I'll show you that in a moment. Another important point is that individuals vary with the number of copies of this SMN2 gene. And as you can see here, the more copies you have of this SMN2 gene, the milder the phenotype, okay? And that'll be important when I go into the clinical talk. The number of copies is also important when you look at survival on these Kaplan Meier. So if you have only one copy of the SMN2 backup gene, you have a very dismal outlook with survival in the terms of days and weeks. And it's somewhat better with 2 copies and then 3. And then if you have 4 or 5 copies, you have normal survival. And if you look at just the type 1 population, that's the little baby like Charlotte that I showed you. If you have 2 copies, there's a fairly predictable linear decline. And this is in survival or what we call a combined endpoint, survival or progressing to the need for permanent ventilation assistance. Okay, and you can see that how this declines with about half of the babies, the median, getting to this endpoint at about 10 months of age. So this is from a natural history study, which I'll refer to in a moment. And you can see that the babies, they still have type 1 SMA, but if you have 3 copies, it's a somewhat more saltatory course, not quite as severe. We have means of measuring motor function in these weak babies, and there's a World Health Organization scale, and the lowest rung on the ladder is sitting without support. And as I showed you for the babies with the SMA type 1, they don't even reach this lowest rung on the ladder. Okay, so they're very weak. So we had to go to other scales. So there's something called the Hammersmith Infant Neurologic Exam, and these are 8 items, and you can get more points if you achieve some improvement going along from left to right. So most of the babies that are symptomatic with SMA type 1, like Charlotte, are way at this left end. They have 0 or maybe 1 point. And this, you'll see, will be the primary outcome measure, the endpoint that we're going to use in the clinical trial. And what I'll show you is that with treatment with Nusinersen, these babies are achieving skills which are never seen in the normal population with just supportive care. I'm stuck. Could you advance this, please? Or tell me where to point this. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to move into Nusinersen. And this story started with Singh and colleagues in 2006, who identified the ISS site, and it's demonstrated here. It's just adjacent to exon 7. So this is an intron splice silencer site. And Singh came up with the idea, along with others, that at the same time that blocking this site might promote inclusion of exon 7, and it became a target for treatment. And this work was further advanced by Adrian Krainer and colleagues at Cold Spring Harbor. On this next slide, I think I wore out the clicker. I'm going to need some help again. Advance, please. Here we go. So this is the work of Adrian Krainer, and what they did is they very carefully looked at this ISS site, and they found in green areas that enhanced exon 7 inclusion, and in red those that inhibited it. And in so doing, they also walked along. If you could advance again, please. There we go. So they walked along using a variety of 2 MOE ASOs to try to identify that area which had the greatest inclusion of exon 7, as shown here. Okay. So it was based on this strategy that Nusinersen was identified. And this cartoon by Frank Bennett from Ionis, I think, nicely demonstrates this. So you can see here that there are a variety of HNRMPs that block access of the U1 snRNP to the pre-messenger RNA. And in a moment, I hope to show you, if you could advance again. So this is Nusinersen. It's an 18-mer 2-MOE ASO, and you can see how it displaced some of those blocking factors. And it then generates a full-length protein. Okay. Now, this drug has to be given intrathecally, meaning spinal taps are given repeatedly to administer this drug into the spinal fluid. And from the spinal fluid, the drug is then absorbed into the tissue and the cells of the spinal cord and of the brainstem and brain. Okay. Fortunately, there's a very long half-life with administration. So once the ASO is actually absorbed into the tissue, it has a long half-life on the order of several months. And you can see here from some of the preclinical work that was done by Marco Passini and colleagues that there's a dose-response curve. I'm going to continue for the sake of time. And also that there was amelioration of the phenotype, that improvement in the neuromuscular junction and restoration of the muscle. And furthermore, in this animal model, there was improved survival, increase in body weight, and in motor responses. So this formed very strong preclinical support for moving forward into the clinic. And you can see that by the date here, this is 2011, we were already planning on the clinical trials. So this is the paper that was selected as Paper of the Year, and we feel very privileged to receive this award. I want to acknowledge first that this was a huge collaborative effort from my own group at Nemours Children's Hospital in Orlando and Columbia University Medical Center in New York, the Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto, and Stanford University Medical Center in Palo Alto, and a huge number of investigators from the sponsors at Ionis, particularly Stan Crook and Frank Bennett, Kathy Bishop, and many others, and from Biogen. Okay. And if you could advance again, please. Right, so this very quickly shows what the clinical trial looks like. And I want to point out that this was a phase 2 open label study. So all the babies, there were 20 babies here, each one received drug, and there was no active comparator in this study. We used a historical control, which is what I showed earlier. And there were 4 babies treated with a low 6 milligram equivalent dose and 16 at a higher dose of 12 milligrams. And they were treated, you can see here on day 1, and then 2 weeks later, day 15, and then at 3 months and 9 months. And as I'll show subsequently in the next talk, this has changed. We're now giving more loading doses. We're trying to get the drug saturated into the motor neurons, the target cells. But this is where we started. There were 2 loading doses and then thereafter. And these were, the other point I want to make is that these were all symptomatic babies, very similar to Charlotte, the little baby I showed you on the video at the time of enrollment. And most of the babies had 2 copies of that SMN2 gene. So here, 13 out of the 16 in the high dose cohort had these 2 copies. And if you recall from the Kaplan Meier curve, that's the group that has the most predictable decline. And advance, please. Right. So here's the Kaplan Meier curve for these babies. And this is either survival or survival free of the need of permanent ventilation. And you can see it's significantly improved as compared to that natural history control that I showed you earlier. So we thought that this was really quite supportive of a drug effect. And in addition, on those 2, on the motor scales, the Heine that I showed you earlier, as well as something called Chop and Tend, in comparison to natural history, where there's a decline, we actually saw improvement. So there was a divergence here. This was unexpected, that we actually saw improvement in motor function when the natural history shows a decline over time. So again, very supportive. And the next slide, please. And again. Right, so the end again. Right, so we used an electrophysiologic measure called the compound motor action potential, and in babies in a natural history study, at the time of symptom onset, it's a very low and it stays low. And advance, please. And you can see it's low, and then again. And what we observed in this study is that these babies actually showed improvement. So they didn't stay low, they actually showed improvement in two different nerves, the ulnar and the perineal nerve. So again, a strong biomarker response. And next slide, please. And again, right. And I want to move forward quickly because I know I'm running a bit slow. So just quickly to show you that 3 of the babies from this study died, and the parents were most generous in allowing us to obtain autopsy tissue. And from that tissue of these 3 babies, you can see that indeed there was an increase in inclusion of exon 7 in the transcript, as demonstrated here, as compared to untreated children with SMA. And the increase was from about 20% of the transcripts in the untreated to nearly threefold that, 57% in these 3 babies. And these autopsy tissues were obtained at some time after the dosing, so it varied depending on their time of death. And next slide. In addition, we were able to try to quantify by a chemoluminescence assay the SMN protein within the anterior horn of the thoracic spinal cord, and there was a 67% increase in the SMN protein as compared to controls. Next slide. And on immunostaining, you can see that the brown here represents drug in motor neurons and other cells, not only in the lumbar spinal cord where the drug is delivered in the intrathecal space, but also in the thoracic and cervical cord and even up into the brain and the motor cortex as compared to control. And in this table, you can see that all these numbers are above 10 micrograms per gram of tissue, and that's considered the threshold for a clinical response. So by giving this drug intrathecally, we were able to achieve what we felt to be therapeutic levels in tissue throughout the spinal cord. And next slide. So there were no drug-related SAE, serious adverse events, over the 2 years, and now these babies are up to 4 years of age, and that's continued. None have discontinued because of related side effects, and they tolerated these spinal taps remarkably well. And next slide, please. So in conclusion, I think we were able to demonstrate effectively in this phase 2 open-label study that repeated intrathecal delivery of this ASO Nusinersen could be performed in this fragile population of little babies, and that there was good proof of concept of target engagement, that the drug exposure was achieved as we had hoped, that SMN2 splicing was indeed modified with an increase of exon 7 inclusion, and there was an increase in the gene product of the SMN protein concentration in spinal cord tissue. And this was all very supportive of moving forward with further clinical studies, which I'll show you in the next talk. So these are my acknowledgments of my many collaborators, and there's maybe 100 more not represented here. Let me stop, and we can take questions if there's time. Thank you so much for your attention.